Cornelius, Oregon Church of Christ welcomes you. Join us Sunday mornings at Adult Bible Class as we study the book of Romans, where Paul teaches us how to live with one another, honor our government, and above all, remain faithful. Thank you for joining us, and God bless you all.
Visiting, which is always a great thing, but we are at our time to get started. We have brought in our high school class with us. They've all been promoted. They're for the day. They're in the college portion of our class this morning, so they don't know yet that there's a test at the end. So, I think a lot of you would leave if you knew there was a test at the end. Hey, there is a test at the end if you think of it in life, but it's an open book test. So glad to see everybody here, and we'll start off with a word of prayer. Would you join me in a word of prayer? Most Holy God and Father, we're so glad to have a few minutes of our time to talk about your word. We love your word, Father. It's every part of our life, and help us to apply it so that we are successful in serving you. We thank you for this time, and in the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. So, Nana, we've got you in here today, so let you know that. So we're in Romans chapter 14. Romans chapter 14 is a very interesting chapter. For a lot of reasons. One of the things with Romans is that Romans chapter 14 is that it's going to deal with something that a lot of times is a pretty important thing, and that is whenever we don't always see things the same way. Now, that's a super oversimplification of what we're talking about, but it is a place where we sometimes will go when we say, you know, if you see something one way and I see something another way, is there a place for us to kind of reconcile and work this out? And Romans chapter 14 is the conversation that a lot of times comes up. In fact, you'll hear people talk about, you'll hear me sometimes say, well, I think this is a Romans 14 matter. And if you hear me say a Romans 14 matter or a Romans 14 subject, what I'm saying is it might be something where we don't necessarily have to come to an agreement because maybe there's not a right or wrong answer to a subject. And I'm going to clarify that in just a few moments, the kind of ideas like that. But sometimes there are things that there isn't a right or wrong. I can think of a lot of examples of this, but there's just a lot of times where we might not necessarily see eye to eye. In fact, we're going to not always see eye to eye. And we have to figure out how we work together. And Romans 14 is a guideline about that. Romans 14 is a guideline to that. Now, Romans 14 is kind of paralleled with a passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, which is a very similar subject, the idea of Christians working to get along and to dwell together. So I want to go ahead and jump over there. We're going to be here, and the very first verse starts us off thinking about this. It'll say, receive one who is weak in the faith, but not to disputes over doubtful things. For one believes he may eat all things, but he who is weak eats only vegetables. Let not him who eats despise him who does not eat, and let not him who does not eat judge him who eats, for God has received him. Who are you to judge another servant? To his own master he stands or falls. Indeed, he will be made to stand, for God is able to make him stand. One person esteems one day above another. Another esteems every day alike. Let each be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day observes it to the Lord, and he who does not observe the day to the Lord, he does not observe it. He who eats, eats to the Lord. He who gives God thanks. And he who does not eat, to the Lord he does not eat, and gives God thanks. For none of us lives to himself, and no one dies to himself. For if we live to the Lord, and we die to the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we are the Lord's. For this end, Christ died and rose and lived again, that he might be Lord of both the dead and the living. But why do you judge your brother? Or why do you show contempt for your brother? For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. For it is written, as I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, every tongue shall confess to God. So then each of us shall give an account of himself to God. Therefore, let us not judge one another anymore, but rather resolve this, not to put a stumbling block or a cause to fall in our brother's ways. We talked last week about kind of launching into the idea of our mindfulness of each other and the language of the stumbling block in the scriptures. And it's interesting, the stumbling block language in the scriptures goes back to the Old Testament, where there's a law of Moses that says you're not to put a stumbling block in front of a blind person. The idea of somebody that has a weakness in the flesh, you're not to take advantage of that, or you're to be extra careful about that. Those are things that we're trying to think about and trying to understand. Romans 14 is Paul's conversation about these things. Now, I kind of debate whether I want to bring this up first or after we've talked about it, but I'm going to go ahead and launch into first and say what Romans 14 is not talking about. And a lot of times it helps me when I say this isn't something that would fit into this conversation. So let's start off by saying Romans 14 is not saying that if we have a distinction of doctrine that it's okay that we all just, don't resolve that. So I guess probably one question is you're going to say, well, Brian, what do you mean by doctrine? Well, when we look at the list of things he talked about, eating and things like that, we probably understand he's talking about matters of the law of Moses, right? Things that people were commanded to do in the law of Moses that they don't have to do now. But imagine, if you would, that you were, put your mind for a moment as a Jewish Christian. You lived in the first century. If all your life you've lived under the law of Moses. Under the law of Moses, what can't you eat? Pork, yeah, among other things. You can't have shrimp, can't have lobster, pork. And you've never been allowed to eat that. You've always looked at that as something. And by the way, in a culture, when you say you can't eat that, it's unclean, how does it naturally feel to you?
Disgusting.
Yeah, disgusting. There are foods that lots of cultures eat that here in the United States we would never eat. How about dogs? Yeah, right? But that's not an unusual cuisine. In France, horse, there's lots of foods in lots of places that people eat that we would say, oh, I don't want to eat that, Appreciate for a moment, if you were Jewish and all your life you'd looked at pork as abominable, that now you're allowed to eat it, and then you're brought in with a bunch of people that like to eat it. How is it going to feel to you when you sit down at dinner and they say, hey, we're having ham sandwiches? What's your natural inclination going to be? Yeah, ooh, yeah, oh. Or even more so, I do not feel good at all eating this. All my life I've trained myself not to do this, and that's a problem. In 1 Cornelius chapter 8, Paul presents this case in the opposite sense. He says, let's pretend you're a Gentile. And all your life, you would go to the temple market. And at the temple market, it's kind of a strange thing. So what we think would happen is that people would say, I'm going to sacrifice this cow to Baal or to Jupiter or whatever. And they would take the cow and say that your sacrifice is duly noted. They'd butcher it. And then at the back door, they'd run a butcher shop. Maybe a barber shop too. Yeah, we'll talk to Larry. He can know. But a butcher shop. And you could go buy the meat from there. So the idea was you could buy meat that had been brought in as a sacrifice to somebody, and that idea. And so Paul was saying in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, on the other side of this is the Gentile who all his life thought that was something special. He thought, hey, if I'm buying that meat, it's special. And now he's being told an idol is nothing, and that there's nothing to that. And he sits down with somebody who says, I bought this meat at the idol store, and they might say, oh, that used to be a big deal to me. I can't eat that. And so Paul says, you're going to have to be careful. You're going to have to be mindful about this. What would be a matter of doctrine that's indisputable? Baptism is a great one. That's probably the first example I'd go to. Baptism. We would say baptism is a matter of doctrine. Why would we say baptism is a matter of doctrine? What do I mean by that? Yeah, it's not something to be disputed. It's not something we say, well, you can have your opinion, Michael can say it's sprinkling, and Ramon can say it's pouring, and I can say it's immersion. We would say, no, there's an answer to this. There's an answer to this. Paul actually makes it very clear that one of the things we have to be able to do before we come to saying it fits into this category is it can't be something that it's a matter of knowledge. In other words, somebody comes along and says, you know what, we're not supposed to work on Saturday. Somebody says, we're not supposed to work on Saturday. What are they talking about? Sabbath, yeah. We would say, oh, no, I know what you're saying. Not to work on Saturday is the law of Moses. And what can we teach them? It ended, yeah. We very simply teach them it ended. Paul says we have to have knowledge before this this idea kicks in. So if it's something you can be taught, or you need to be taught, it doesn't really work in Romans 14. Because notice Romans 14 never said somebody has a weak conscience, they need to be taught the right thing. There's not an issue to be taught here. There's not a thing where we say, well, we're going to have to sit down and instruct you. This is, like I said, 1 Cornelius chapter 8, the very first thing he says, well, I have to have knowledge. We already have to know certain things about this. This isn't a matter of a Jewish Christian saying it's a sin to eat ham. Because if he says that, what's the answer to that dilemma? Teach him it's not the law. It's not, like I said, you can teach. So doctrine is something you can teach. You can say, let's sit down, let's study this. We can understand it alike. The Bible says, one of those great passages, Ramon and I were talking about Ephesians 3 the other day. One of those great passages, Paul says, if you read, you can understand. We can all understand the Bible. And the Bible even says we can understand it alike. That's a claim the Bible makes about itself. That's a pretty profound claim. And based on that, we don't say, well, this guy says you got to be sprinkled. This guy says you got to be immersed. Who's to say? Neither of them, because the Bible says. Because we say, we can understand the Bible alike. We can read this. And if somebody says, well, I just don't see it, we can honestly say, well, you're probably not looking. There's probably, Paul several times says if somebody in 2 Thessalonians 2, he says that they don't have a love of the truth, they're not gonna want to understand this. There's a lot of things to consider here. But ultimately, if it's something you can study out, it doesn't fit in Romans 14. It's not something that you can fit. So number one. Number two, if it's something that comes down to a matter of discipline. Now, discipline, is a change of behavior, a change in the way we think. So somebody comes in and says, hey, you shouldn't be eating ham sandwiches, or you shouldn't be working on Saturday, both things from the law of Moses. We would say, well, and if you are, you're sinning, you need to change. That doesn't work because, going back, first of all, that's a doctrinal statement. But second of all, this is not something that we're telling somebody else they can and can't do something. That doesn't work either. This isn't a passage about things we can and can't do. This is a passage about what am I thinking about if somebody else is bothered by something, and it's not a matter of doctrine. It can't be something. And number three, this one maybe is one that sometimes surprises people. It's not really meant to apply to doctrinal things. So maybe I'll be careful. I'm trying to think how we'd say this. Let's say somebody here says, Brian, I just don't feel good about using PowerPoint. It feels very flashy. It feels kind of, I came from a denomination and they had a big light show and, Brian, you put light stuff up and it almost feels like that. I think we shouldn't do it. Now, acknowledge, that might be a genuine concern. But Romans 14 isn't meant for us to then tell the congregation they need to change. The whole congregation needs to submit to one person's weakness. This isn't about the congregation. This is about one-on-one. This is about one-on-one. Somebody says, I'm not comfortable with something, we shouldn't do it as a church. Romans 14 really isn't the place to go for that. We're not really meant to be telling each other as a group, what, this bothers me, so the rest of you shouldn't do it. That's not, I'll say it like this, we're not meant to hold the congregation hostage by our weakness. This is about one-on-one things we do together as a group or as individuals or relating with each other as individuals. We see it here, we see it in 1 Cornelius chapter 8. Those are three things that we go to. So I know we really haven't dug too much into what is Romans 14, but does anybody have any comments about what I've said here? Please go ahead.
A few weeks ago, you made a comment about not wearing odor-causing things on behalf of, because of what it does to somebody else.
Yeah. So what's interesting about that would be, it is something I do. It's not something I do as a congregation. That's a good question because we're talking about something I'm doing in the assembly. But it might be something to say, and I'm not sure if I would say it's a Romans 14 necessarily either. This is kind of an interesting point because we might be talking about somebody's medical need. Vice versa, if somebody said, I tried to think of a better example. That's a good example to say of something we do, but at the same time, it's also not something we can bind. I can't say, if, let's say Michael says, you know what, I cannot tolerate the smell of this one thing. maybe Michael needs to sit away from, if you're the guy that's wearing that, maybe Michael also needs to make a choice to sit away. And like I said, again, it works within the context of Romans 14 to a degree because we're talking about one-on-one. We're talking about, this bothers one person, so I'll make this choice. But we would not have the authority as a congregation to say nobody's allowed to wear cologne, because we don't have that kind of drive. We might ask the congregation, say, hey, members of the congregation, we'd like you to do this. But nobody has the authority to tell the congregation, can't wear cologne because it bothers me. Now, what's tricky here is it's not a matter of weakness, it's a matter of physical, so that's a little different than that.
And I think it's a matter of love.
It is.
Be
Yeah.
careful. And so when the situation about the food for different people, we love the person who is still committed to some of those disciplines.
Yeah.
And so we won't judge them for it. I mean,
Yeah.
that's where our love comes in.
So, Stephen, you said it well, because this chapter is really all about love. It's all about how do I think about the other people that I, whether they're in my family, spiritual family or what, am I mindful of them and the things that they go through or their struggle or their faith or in a moment I'm going to say, what exactly are we talking about when he says their weakness, and that's going to be a big part of what we're defining too. So, Stephen, I appreciate that because it's a great example of kind of a thing that doesn't exactly fit in Romans 14. And like I said, a lot more doesn't fit in Romans 14 than does. And sometimes it's, Stephen, I think you said it well to say sometimes almost any issue can be resolved with love. You can, by the right loving attitude, whether it's the love of the truth or the love of each other, we can find the way to go on that. And so that's a nice way of putting it. Stanley, go ahead.
My comment on my question on 22, my question is it referring to moral sins or, I want to understand that.
Good. Stanley, I'll go a little further on this. So Romans 14 does not apply to matters of discipline. Discipline is the idea, and I should have said church discipline, to say when the church has an authority to ask somebody to change their behavior, and I put 1 Corinthians 5, the man who was living in sin, and Paul said the church is obligated to tell him he can't live this way anymore. Well, what if the man had said, well, why not Romans 14 this, Why don't we just let me live this way and you live your way and we'll be together? Romans 14 can't fix something that is a matter of discipline, where somebody's doing something that the church needs to correct. It's not a Romans 14 thing. Or we can't take something that's a Romans 14 thing and say, now the whole church has to correct and change for the sake of this. I'm trying to think of a good example of the second point there, Stanley, but maybe the idea of saying, again, somebody says, my feeling is I don't like the idea of worshiping in the daylight, so I want to worship at night. Do we need to change the whole church's behavior to accommodate my feeling on that? It doesn't work that way. And again, it even goes down back to the third one maybe about congregational matters. But we don't, if something needs to be addressed as being sinful, we can't put it in Romans 14. And I say this, Stanley, because sometimes people do. Sometimes people want to say, well, we don't all see the same way on something like marriage and divorce. I've heard this one a lot. So we ought to say that's just a Romans 14 matter. Absolutely not. Because we're told explicitly that deals with things that are sins, and that can't be something that fits in Romans 14. Romans 14 can't hold something that's, that the Bible is telling us is sin, something that's, that again, by knowledge, we can resolve. So if there's a matter like that, we can't say, well, we're just going to let this person do this thing that we think is wrong as a church, and Romans 14 will cover it. It doesn't cover it. It doesn't work. Does that make more sense, Stanley, to explain it like that?
Yeah, so it doesn't allow moral sins.
It doesn't allow
Moral sins.
more. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, that would be another way to put it. Yeah, it doesn't allow something sinful to be overlooked. Maybe, Stanley, I should have said it that way. I think that would have been a stronger way to say it. Ramon?
I was thinking of a way that a congregation maybe needs to change because of one person. Maybe you come to see a congregation and they're applying this just to hold a beat to a hymn, or they have a small instrument, and then you go there to place membership with them, maybe you can teach them that having an instrument or holding a beat by just clapping is not something that is beautiful.
So Ramon's example is you go into a congregation and they're using a musical instrument, let's say. And let's say, and Ramon, this is kind of interesting because there's almost a, could I backdoor and tell the congregation, Romans 14, I'm offended by this, and you shouldn't do it. Now that'd be tempting, and a lot of people might say, okay, we won't do it for that reason, but that's not really the way we're supposed to approach it. We're supposed to say, let me show you why the Bible shows us that we don't have God's permission to bring those things in. Let me explain to you, let me teach you. Romans 14 doesn't, like I said, you saw nowhere in the chapter where it says, hey, teach your brother what's right so that he'll start doing the right thing. That's not part of this conversation. Your example, it would be. You're going to have to teach them why an instrument is not there. Now, like I said, might be great if they said, we'll just stop for a while we study this to save your conscience. That'd be nice, I would appreciate that. But ultimately, like I said, the real issue is it has to be taught. Does that make sense? It's like I said, so it's a good example of what we want to see with this. So like I said, these are things that don't fit here. Hopefully it'll make a little more sense. Like I said, if I say these aren't things that fit in here, then you're starting to think, well, Brian, what's left? That's what I want you to be thinking. Brian, what else could there be that's going to fit in this? And we're gonna get that. Anybody else have a comment? Wendy, go.
I do. I'm trying to think of how to say this, but I love how he starts the chapter with not to quarrel over opinions.
Nice.
Because this kind of goes a little bit like what you and I were talking about this morning. We should focus more on our relationship with God and using that to cultivate a attitude of obedience and not use Romans 14 as justification to push my personal opinions on other people. So I love how he starts it right there with, we're not quarreling over opinions.
Yeah.
This is not well, I kind of like this way, so I'm going to be like, well, I'm going to push this because it's just how I feel. I want something.
Right. And what's important about that, Wendy, so I was actually, that in my mind, it was going to the idea of, we should be able to pursue through love, going back to what Stephen said about love. Through love, I should be able to find God's will and be able to demonstrate to others what God's will is through the scriptures. But this idea of saying that sometimes, by the way, I should have added this on the list to say, Romans 14 could never be applied by somebody starting out by saying, I'm the weaker brother, so here's what I want you to do. You just proved that's not what this story is, that's not this conversation. Romans 14 isn't the place for you to say, this is what you need to do for me. Romans 14 is God saying, hey, when you elevate your mind spiritually, you start thinking about what can I do to help others in their walk. That's what this is about. It's not, like I said, there should never be a conversation where somebody says, you know what, this bothers me, so let's Romans 14 and just not do it. You've just misapplied the text. And that's a great way of putting that, that you just misapplied what's being said. Paul doesn't allow, that's not what this is about. So if you ever say, hey, I'm the weaker brother, you've probably missed the mark on this one. You probably aren't grabbing what the depth of this is. And I've been tempted to say it, so it's not. I imagine probably some of us have said it because it's just not an uncommon thing. Stephen?
Just curious, would head coverings fall into a Romans 14?
Let's say now, Stephen, I appreciate that comment because that steps us into a yes and no conversation. That steps us into a yes and no conversation. It could be to say, if I say, all my life, I prayed with the head cover, or obviously that doesn't work. I don't have the head cover. I don't even have the natural head cover, right? That means my prayers go faster, by the way. That's nothing interferes. But the truth is, let's say I always prayed, if I'm a woman, I always prayed with a head covering. And somebody sat down and said, well, if we study this out, like I said, maybe somebody here would disagree, but I'm looking around guessing nobody's going to disagree with this. But I would say by studying 1 Corinthians chapter 11, we could probably reasonably conclude that it is not an obligation or a part of the law of Christ that you have to wear a head covering. I think, like I said, we can always study that another time in the future. If you always say, well, why does he talk about that? 1 Corinthians 11, I think we can study that and understand that. Now, I might say, I still don't feel comfortable doing it, but I know it's not the law of Christ. And I think we have that sometimes whenever we have a visitor that'll put on a veil. They're not saying, I think everybody else should be doing it. They're just saying, this is how I feel. I feel more comfortable about it. And so that would be a Romans 14 fit to say, I'm doing this because I feel kind of, I feel guilty if I'm not doing it, or I don't feel comfortable if I'm not doing it. I feel like, I've heard people describe it like I feel naked, or I feel, okay. Then that would fit nicely for what he's talking about, this feeling about it. Now, when is it not a Romans 14 issue? When I say, hey, everybody, 1 Corinthians 11 says you have to do it. Then it ceases to be that, it becomes a matter of doctrine, and we have to study out doctrine. So if somebody says, 1 Corinthians 11 says I have to have my head covered, then we have to study out and say, well, what do the scriptures say about that? How do we come to a resolution about that? So that's the other thing to think about here, is that what you brought up, Stephen, is interesting. And by the way, I think any matter could fit in both, or a lot of things will fit in both, because the moment we say, and everybody, I feel uncomfortable doing this, and nobody else should either, then we've stepped beyond, and it becomes something that doesn't fit in Romans 14 anymore. So head covering is a very interesting one, because it could fit in, and then maybe on some circumstances it might not, if I feel like it's something everybody else should do too. If I am judging other people and saying, oh, they're all in sin because they're not doing the right thing, I've gone too far. We haven't got to that part of Romans 14, but he'll elaborate on that matter of me just looking down on people for these things. And that's a big part of what this is. If I'm looking down on, if I wear a head covering and I'm looking down on somebody who doesn't, I'm no longer covered by Romans 14. So I'm no longer fitting in Romans 14. Stanley, please.
Well, when I first came here, the use of PowerPoint and then the use of, let me put it differently, is the instrument you use to give tone, a musical instrument, or what justification do you have compared to this PowerPoint stuff?
So Stanley asked a good question. Stanley, I appreciate this question. So the question is, but do we have an authority to use something like PowerPoint? Well, when we talk about the idea of the authority to teach, we will use a term, sometimes we talk about specific authority. What's the other side of that? Generic or general authority, right. And specific authority is something that has a very specified application. An example might be with the Lord's Supper. There's several things that are very specific about the Lord's Supper. What are they? Bread. The bread, yeah, it's unleavened bread. It's fruit of the vine. It's the first day of the week. Those are things that are specific to it. Now, generally speaking, the bread, it could be made by Heather, or we can buy it, or the fruit of the vine, it might be purple grape juice. It might, sometimes I'm going to say any vine, but I usually say, I think it's supposed to be grape, but let's just say it could be clear. It could be, something we make, something we buy. First day of the week, what's general about that? The time. We do it in the morning, we do it in the evening. I dare say, I think we can even do it twice. On a Sunday. I don't think I think that's authorized as well, but I'm going to be careful to say I could see debate if I'm not careful. But the point is that there's general and specific. Now, let's go to teaching. Teaching has specific things. What's specific about teaching according to the authority of the scriptures? Somebody said it. Truth, yeah, what I teach. There are, 1 Timothy chapter 1 gives specific lists of things I teach and things I don't teach. And, going back to what Wendy said about, argumentation and such, one of the things is he says don't teach fables, don't teach, so he gives about the teach. Now, how do I teach? What things am I using? Well, in the scriptures, we know that when they taught, they used different mechanisms of teaching. Can you think of what I mean by that? Paul on Mars Hill, what did he use? It's his mouth, right? He just taught. Paul to the Ephesians, what did he use? A letter, right? A letter, and several times he'll say this is meant to teach. we would say that teaching is a general authority. And so long as I am mindful of the specific things that I'm using to teach, I am general in authority. Now, general authority, boy, this authority is always a tough one. And I shouldn't try to get it done in just about 2 minutes, but I'm going to try, Stanley, and it's not going to be a great answer for you for that. Let me finish this and I'll come back to you, okay? Just to say this, under general authority, I still have to make sure it is expedient. Meaning, it's not, it doesn't fail to accomplish tasks. Ramon was talking about expedient. You asked one of your sons, what does expedient mean? And your son said, Ramon, I'm putting you on the spot if you remember. He said, it's the best way to do something. That was what Michael said. So even an unbeliever, Michael's not a Christian yet, but he said, expedient means it's the best way to do something. We're only allowed to do things that are the best way to do it. We might use a monitor because it's not very, anymore they're not very expensive. It's not very unusual. And visually, you can see the passages I point to or talk about, just as though I wrote them on a board, or in times past, they had those old overheads, or remember flannel sheets? Yeah, and flannel. We've used a lot of different techniques throughout history. We wrote things down. Paul is writing things down. This is effectively writing things down. So long as I'm not going beyond being expedient, if I go to the men next Sunday at our men's meeting, I say, guys, I need $100,000 flash team for, okay, Brian, that's ridiculous. Because it's not expedient, though, to that end. So, Stanley, I cut you off a second because you had a second part of that. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, I just want to focus on the instrument we used to give, the sorcery that's used to give tongue.
Oh, yes. Okay, I'm sorry. The pitch pipe. Oh, good one. So, so the pitch pipe. Now, this is interesting because pitch pipes have sometimes caused a little bit of, isn't it a musical instrument? So here's what's interesting about the pitch pipe. What is the concept of what, bringing a musical instrument in? What is the purpose of bringing a musical instrument in if somebody brings it in?
To play music.
To play music,
Nobody played music.
to make music, to accompany music, all things we say, what did God say he wants? Sing. So we have no authority to use a pitch pipe to sing for us, to sing with us, or to make music with us. So what do we have an authority for this? All right, so that the song leader can start at the right pitch. Now, we have to say then that would fit in the general sense of whether it's a songbook or a written music or written notes. Those are things that we use in order to expedite our ability to sing. They're generic authority. Now, like I said, why is it sometimes this comes up as a question? Because pitch pipes look and sound like harmonicas, which are musical instruments. I'm going to say something kind of wild, and I hesitate to say it because I think somebody might say, oh, that's a terrible idea. But I heard a story once of a guy that they moved into a building, and they had a piano in the building already, a musical instrument, but the song leader would go up and hit the C when he got ready to sing. I think that's not unreasonable. I don't think it's expedient. In other words, I don't think you should go get a piano just so you can hit the middle C. You can just have that little pocket device that rings. I knew a song leader that would beep his watch, and he could tell by the key of the beep where to start. I was always impressed by that. We've seen tuning forks and things like that. But why do we have an authority to use those? Because we're saying they're not singing, they're not making music, but they're making it so that we're able to. Just like a songbook isn't singing for us, it's not making music for us, but it is permitting itself to make for us to accomplish that task. Just like having a building permits us to accomplish the task of assembling together. Go ahead, Stephen.
I might argue that the expedient includes the ability to maintain a harmonious orderliness.
Yeah.
So that everybody's not singing out of
Yeah.
Which is-
So Stephen brings up, you didn't mention the verse, but let's say decently and in order, 1 Cornelius chapter 14, that there's an implied point there that we're supposed to be doing things decently and in order, and, harmonious singing. It's kind of interesting. The word symphony means, the Bible uses the word symphony a lot of times to describe the work of the church, believe it or not. The Greek word symphonious talks about the idea of us all working and hearing the same, and several times the Bible uses that about the unity of the church, so it's kind of a neat idea, thing like that. Stanley, there's a lot more I could say about this. I'm going to say it might be better if I reserve that more for another time, but it is a really good question. You have one more point, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that my final comment is that I really thank you, because I heard this way back in Ghana some years, and I read it, that is also going on in some of the churches of Christ. So when I came here and then saw it myself, then I tried to also analyze it. I became a little confused, but later on, I asked myself, those response that you have given, we are not using it to sing, and then those kind of things. So I became comfortable. And today is, you have given me more clarity.
Thank you for asking. And I would encourage anybody that when you say, hey, why do we have this? Why do we have that? Ask. Because we should be able to give you an answer. And if we aren't able to give you an answer, maybe we didn't think things through. Now, one last thing I'll add to this to say, Romans 14, I've already said, doesn't fit for congregational matters, but sometimes the question of expediency does. A lot of times it's this matter of, we talked about this, I remember recently we were talking about whether or not it was a good idea to broadcast our worship service. I don't think it's, like I said, I think it's a matter of right or wrong. We don't have a strong way one or the other, but we said, and this is a men's study we said, but maybe it's not always expedient because it could cause some people to stumble. Now, we did Romans 14. We said that the church is only authorized to act in expedient ways, and once it could cause problems, it ceases to be expedient. So going back to the PowerPoint or this, if this causes division in the congregation, it ceases to be expedient. And that's important. It's not Romans 14, but it does matter because expediency needs to be the best way to do it, and if it causes problems, it's not expedient. And so that's another characteristic, again, when somebody says, well, let's talk about what we do within the church. In Romans 14, you're saying doesn't really fit to the church. What does? We have this conversation about expediency. And again, not something we talk about a lot because it's a little complicated. We've got some sermons in the past, though, if you want to dig around in those. I want to go to one more point, unless anybody has another comment or thought. Those are good questions. This is a great opportunity for asking questions. I like asking questions as a group because I promise any question you have, 5 other people have. So I'm glad, like I said, when Stanley asks a question or makes the comments he does, it's useful to a lot of people. And sometimes people say, well, I never thought about it, but I do now, And so that's good. Anyone else? Terry, go ahead.
So when you broadcast sermons, I don't want to go on Sunday, so I just watch it on TV.
Right, and that's the concern that the expediency matter raised up. Is it possible that people would make a choice that, well, I'm worshiping at home rather than with the assembly? Is it possible that might make people stumble? And Terry, that's exactly the conversation the men had to say, that might make it unexpedient. It's okay that, we record a sermon or we even recorded the whole assembly and people watched it another time. You learn from, when we sing together, we're teaching each other. These are all authorized under our command to go to teach the world. But sometimes that teaching could cease to be expedient if it's leading people to think they're accomplishing something they're supposed to be doing in person.
It says we're supposed to assemble.
Yeah, that's right. And we don't want, and the question was, is it possible that could raise, and again, under expediency, whether or not it is expedient to do this because the possibility could cause a problem. And so, Terry, you're exactly right. Exactly right. Ryan, go ahead.
I'm just thinking about in verse 1 it talks about, in New King James, it's doubtful things. Some translations say scruples, some say opinions, but it gives us the idea that you don't argue about things that are scruples or speculation.
Right.
Or,
Sorry, yeah. And by the way, Ryan, what's interesting is in 1 Timothy, the book of 1 Timothy, chapter 3, verse 15 says it's all about setting up the local church. It's all about how the local church operates. And beginning and into that book, he says, don't get caught up debating meaningless things, useless things, trivial things, unimportant things, matters of opinion, matters. And so it's fascinating, Ryan, and then by the way, he tells Titus the same thing. In his letter to Titus, he says, and don't get caught up debating things that don't matter. That's a huge danger that we face as a church. George, and then Stephen? Oh, no.
I was just going to mention a minute ago that I had a conversation with a neighbor, and he said, I don't go to church, I just watch it.
Yeah. So again, we see why that becomes, to a lot of people. I mean, I think 50 years ago, most people, even unbelievers, would say, well, you need to be at church, and they might listen in on something, but they would say, there would be a different mindset today. Stephen?
Well, I'm just thinking about those that Doug and I have been visiting.
Yeah.
Some of them, there's no way they're going to ever come to church.
Sure.
And they miss all this.
And that's where you see that there would be a benefit to it for them to have that opportunity. And it's the question of at what point does the benefit cease to be more beneficial? And what we're really saying is, when is it less expedient? And that's a tough question. By the way, it's not a black and white answer for sure. So it's not a black and white answer for sure. And number two, sometimes we have to be careful to say, we're not going to do that, but then the church down the street does, Well, they might have found it to be expedient, and that's okay. The church autonomy means they make a choice, we make a choice on expedient things, and that's fitting to this. Ryan?
A lot of times I'm just like, I'll watch an old sermon.
Yeah, right.
Home. It's not the same as watching a service. I know it's not the same as service. It's just
Yeah.
I like to watch a sermon at home when I'm sick.
So that's why we just put the sermons up instead, so that if somebody is at home and they say, I'd like some kind of connection, we have services, we have Bible classes. Talk to Gregor. He's all on, he manages all that. And if somebody says, I really miss, Gregor records Bible classes. They're available. Gregor there is an ability, to some degree, we're trying to balance the best answers. Like I said, I didn't want to go too far into that subject, other than to say we've talked about it in the past, and it is a congregational matter. How did we solve it? By determining what was expedient or not expedient. Well, last thing I want to hit before we even get into our text. What is he talking about when he says weakness? Receive somebody who is weak in the faith. Weak is a tricky word because it gets used a lot of different ways in the Bible. As I was sitting down thinking about this earlier, in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 30, Paul says that because they weren't taking the Lord's Supper in a fitting way, he says, some of you are weak and some of you are asleep. And what do you think he was saying there when he said that, George?
They're weak in the ability to discern what the truth is.
Yeah, they're weak, and what does he usually mean when he says they're asleep? They might be dead, spiritually dead. Physically dead. I don't think they all died because they weren't taking the Lord's Supper. But I think he is saying maybe some people are falling away over this. So there's a weakness that comes from a lack of understanding that leads to spiritual death. That's not what we're talking about here. But that is one way that the word weak is used. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 10, Paul talked about his own weakness. He calls it his thorn in the flesh. Something that has affected his life that has made him weak. What could it be? Well, there's a lot of speculation. Some say, well, maybe it was his eyesight. Maybe it was a person, calls him a messenger of Satan. Maybe it was just some kind of affliction he had. But it made him weak. It made him weak. Some of us, if you get sick, you're weak. Is that what we're talking about? The answer, no. No, we're not talking about the idea of something that actually restrains or limits us or makes us weak. 1 Peter chapter 3, I actually don't remember what I wrote there, so I have to jump over there and read it again. In 1 Peter chapter 3, we have a third use of the word weakness. And he says, husbands likewise, dwell with your wives in understanding, giving honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel. What is he describing there? What's weakness there? Yeah, physical strength is probably the characteristic that immediately comes to our mind. Again, not what we're talking about here. Weakness here is probably the way Paul is talking about in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, when he says, uphold and strengthen those who are weak, those who are struggling. And the point he's going to say is this weakness, in this case, is manifested, he says, by things that we feel comfortable eating or days that we feel comfortable observing, and we are now at our time. I didn't really get very far. But that's okay. Romans 14 is complicated. We had some fantastic questions. And again, I love it when we ask good questions that we can talk about as a group. We can all hear answers to and say, oh, okay. Helps us all to understand things well. And I appreciate, like I said, good questions like that. So next week we'll pick up Romans 14 and we'll delve in, understanding better how this works, how it is that we're supposed to be mindful of one another.
Thank you for joining the Church of Christ in Cornelius, Oregon. We can be found on our website. You can scan the QR code on your screen or the CD you were given, or on Facebook at facebook.com/Cornelius Church of Christ. Thank you and God bless.